Hi, everyone. This is Alex Epstein, host of Power Hour, and this week we have another Best of Power Hour. This week's topic is our energy resources. And at a time when we hear constantly about sustainability, the implication of which is that our modern capitalist industrial civilization is somehow unsustainable, it's very important to understand the nature of resources. And on this episode, Robert Bradley Jr., who's been a great friend and mentor of mine in energy, explains the different theories on resources and why, at least as I would put it, resources are something that we create from nature, not something that we take from nature. Also related to this, related to Rob at least, he just published a very nice article about me and about climate catastrophism in his great blog, Master Resource, which you can check out at masterresource.org. So we will link to that in our newsletter, but you can also check it out just by going to masterresource.org. And I think it's today, which I'm recording this on February 25th. So enjoy this episode with Rob on our energy resources, and we'll be back with another episode next week. Also, if you are not on my mailing list and want to be, sign up at alexepsteinlist.com. That's alexepsteinlist.com. Thanks.
Power Hour. Coal. Oil. Natural gas. Power Hour, the show where today's top energy experts break down today's top energy issues. No sound bites, no talking points, no nonsense, no BS, no softball questions, no vagueness, just in-depth analysis and ruthless clarity. Power Hour. Here's your host, Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm your host, Alex Epstein, and I should say welcome to Power Hour Weekly, since we are now a weekly show thanks to the generosity of all of you after our little campaign last month. We have all new equipment. We're actually going to start doing video next week, so there may be a few technical snags. I hope I've ironed out everything in advance, but in any case, you're going to be getting new energy knowledge weekly now. Starting next week, I hope, I'm almost certain actually, you'll be seeing us on video, so we'll have the full episode and excerpts on YouTube, which should help promote the show a lot. And we will have author Pierre Desrochers, who's been on this show before, talking about his new book, The Locavore's Dilemma. And I'm reading it right now. It's absolutely unbelievable in terms of what you can learn about the history of agriculture and how dangerous actually the seemingly benign local agriculture movement is. But that is not what we're talking about today. Today we are talking about one of the most important aspects of energy, which is the issue of resources. One of the most common claims, or one of the most common criticisms you'll hear about a free market in energy, which is something that I support, the show in general supports, is that we are, with the sources of energy we use now, the leading sources such as coal, oil, natural gas, we're inevitably going to run out. The most common version of this that you'll probably hear is called peak oil. It's most often propagated with regard to oil because oil is so essential to the world economy, and yet people say, well, there's a finite amount of it, so isn't it going to run out, and isn't that going to be a disaster? Now, we've talked about this on the show before, but there's one aspect that we haven't talked about, I think, nearly enough, and that's what today's show is about, and that's what today's guest is a particular expert on, and that is a historical perspective on this issue. When this is announced in the news, I saw the other day in the New York Times, there was an article, I think it was called Let's Be Less Productive, and the author of the article is the author of a book about how, what do we do since we're on, and in fact, what do we do since we live on a finite planet? How do we, we don't have enough resources. And what most people don't realize is that this is a claim that goes a long, long way back, and that there's been a lot of thinking about this issue on both sides, and that there's been a lot of testing of this issue in reality. So our guest today, Dr. Robert Bradley Jr., in his work, and particularly in his book Capitalism at Work, which was published a couple years ago, gives a really brilliant history of the thought on energy resources. So what Dr. Bradley is going to do is he's going to take us through a tour of the history of the theories about resources and then what actually happened in practice. And then knowing that history, we're a lot better prepared to have an informed view of the issue. So Dr. Bradley is the founder and CEO of the Institute for Energy Research. And on a more personal note, more than anyone in the world of energy, he has helped me in my career. He's helped the show actually dramatically. He's helped us introduce us to a number of the guests. So I'll talk more about that later. But for now, Rob, welcome to Power Hour.
Good to be with you, Alex.
All right. So in Capitalism at Work, you have some really interesting chapters on resources. Can you tell us how far back this idea that we're running out of resources goes?
Yes. Well, the subtitle of the book is Business, Government, and Energy. And the second half of the book is a history of thought of the idea of minerals, and in particular energy minerals, being different from the general basket of goods and services. And Adam Smith, for example, in The Wealth of Nations, to my knowledge, does not differentiate between minerals, fixed resources in the earth, and producible goods and services. But I think, or at least the first treatise on energy that looked at minerals differently was William Stanley Jevons' The Coal Question, which was published back in 1865. And Jevons' book is sort of the Wealth of Nations for energy and mineral economics. It was the first book to really think in terms of so-called fixed supply. And as far as the context for Jevons, at the time, his home country, England, was producing most of the coal that was consumed in the world in the 1860s. England was producing coal for all its own energy needs, and it was exporting about half of the coal that was used by the rest of the world. And so Jevons noted that there was an industrial boom going on with locomotion fueled by coal, and a lot of the machinery of the Industrial Revolution being powered by coal. And he was asking the question, well, what's the future? And he was very concerned that England was going to lose its national prominence because it was going to not so much run out of coal, but it would just become more high cost to mine coal. At the time, the demand for coal was very high in the country, and they were digging deeper and deeper to find coal. So Jevons concluded that England was going to run out of low-cost coal, and that the coal industry was going to move to other regions of the world with more abundant supplies, such as the United States, and therefore young people in England would be moving to other countries of the world, such as the U.S., and England would be in perilous economic times. So that was the context in which he wrote.
So one interesting thing I think about the evolution of this thought, as you describe in the book, is that when you start with Jevons is a really interesting figure. He's one of the founders of modern economics, and so he knows a lot about economics. He doesn't say stuff like, yeah, we're going to run out. As you said, he says we're going to the price will go up, so it'll, relatively speaking, it'll become scarce compared to other things. One thing that I notice about Jevons, although I think I'm certain history proves him to be wrong and he can be theoretically refuted, is that he really valued the resource that he was concerned about. Today, often you'll hear this weird coupling of people saying, oil is evil, we shouldn't use it, and oh, by the way, we're running out of it. But of course, if we were running out of it, they should be really happy about that. That should be a plus in their mind. So that's a little suspicious. Whereas with Jevons, he has all of these amazing statements about how important coal was. Tell us a little bit about his positive view of coal, and then his view of coal relative to, let's say, wind power, which was also an issue at that time.
Right. Yes. At the time, coal was really energy, modern energy. And coal displaced the primary energies of before, which were all renewable. They were using wind in different applications. Falling water was a major source of energy, and particularly burning wood and plants, what we would call today primitive biomass, was a major energy source. So before coal came along, Jevons recognized that it was renewables that were the primary energies. And as a matter of fact, renewable energy had a 100% market share prior to the rise of coal energy, which is interesting because that corresponded to the poverty era of mankind. So the idea that somehow renewable energy is the future and that renewables can power an industrial age has it exactly backwards. So what Jevons did in the coal question is he carefully went over all the earlier energies, which were renewable. Each was renewable, and he explained why they were not suited for the modern era. For example, falling water, what today we would call hydropower. If there's a drought and you don't have water from higher elevations going to lower elevations to create energy, then you're out of luck. With wind power, the wind sometimes blows, sometimes it doesn't, and there's no batteries at the time, and still today batteries are highly uneconomic. Then you have your energy source going on and off in an unpredictable way, which is ill-suited for modern energy uses. And in biomass, primitive biomass, Jevons said to replace coal, you would have to have huge land masses growing plants and trees, and really more land mass than could possibly be dedicated to this. So Jevons saw coal as the beginning of a new energy era. He emphasized how coal was vastly superior to anything that had come before, and in so doing, he identified energy as what Julian Simon today would call the master resource.
Right. On that note of the difference between, you said something to the effect of coal was energy at the time, and this topic of hydrocarbons versus renewables. I wrote an article recently on your blog, Master Resource, called "Progressive Energy versus Renewable Energy," and I can put up a link to that later. I won't recapitulate the whole thing, but one aspect of it was that what we think of energy today means cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. And by that standard, so-called renewables aren't really energy, and that's what I take it Jevons was pointing to. If you search Jevons, Jevons, on masterresource.org or on industrialprogress.net, you'll find a lot of really interesting quotes from him about just the extent to which having a cheap, plentiful, reliable source had improved human life versus the intermittent and dilute sources that are often called renewables. So I think what he points to is that the essence of what energy is not really about how long does the fuel source last or the potential source last. Does it last 5 billion years or might it be 500 years? Does it provide this caliber of energy? But that's a whole topic in and of itself. I want to ask for a second, what is the relationship between Jevons and Malthus? Because when we talk about resources running out, Thomas Malthus is often the first name that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's a good question. Malthus was looking mainly at agriculture, and out of Malthus and his book, A Principle on Population, which came out in the late 17th, early 18th century, he saw that human population was increasing faster than the agricultural foodstuffs necessarily to support the increasing population. Therefore, the difference would be misery or vice, people dying of disease, of wars, and living at subsistence, which was a very gloomy view, and that out of that comes the Malthusian view. Well, Jevons sort of was working in the Malthus tradition in the sense that he was looking at minerals now as the key strategic and scarce, relatively scarce factor. And Jevons was a Malthusian in the sense that he warned and turned out to be way too pessimistic regarding coal in his home country. Jevons was not saying we were running out of coal worldwide. What he was saying was that his own country's prosperity was on the wane because it was running out of low cost or competitive coal. So in one sense, Jevons was a Malthusian, but in another sense, he really didn't address the question of globally running out of coal. And
wait, Rob. Let me jump in there. But it seems I don't see how it could be anything else. That is, because it seems like his arguments are. It's more than just England doesn't happen to have that much coal, because of course it was the coal leader in the world for a while. It seems like what he's saying about there's only a fixed amount at a certain point, we're going to deplete it. That's going to lower our standard of living when that happens. That seems like it would inevitably have to happen to America, even if he's not making a specific forecast about America.
I think that can be implied. Jevons, his book came out in 1865, and in the United States, we had the beginning of the commercial oil industry with the first commercial oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. That was 1859. So Jevons was a little behind in realizing that a whole nother carbon-based energy resource, petroleum, was arising to join coal. And natural gas was virtually unknown at the time because gas was being made from coal. So Jevons sort of he didn't forecast the end of cheap coal for the world, but he was too pessimistic toward his home country's coal supply, which turned out to be a lot more abundant and lower cost than he thought. But he really didn't foresee or recognize that coal was part of something much bigger, and that is a carbon-based energy era where there's coal, there's petroleum, and there's natural gas.
Just a quick note on natural gas. I mean, pretty early on, they did discover natural gas, right? It was a hazard. It was something that was blowing up.
Yeah, it was around,
rigs.
and there were ancient uses of natural gas. You know, every now and then it would be springing up at the surface, and they were different localities and people were using it in innovative ways. But as far as commercial wells and a pipeline system, that was much slower to come. That would really come after coal began the carbon-based energy era.
Right. One of the reasons that it's helpful to bring up petroleum and then also natural gas being effectively unusable, even though, as we know now, there's a ton of it, is it starts to point to there's something wrong with historically the way people think of quote natural resources, because these things like oil and natural gas and even coal aren't naturally a resource. People are continually because you don't automatically find them and you don't automatically know how to use them. And what we see is people are finding these new things and then they're finding uses for things that were previously not resources. Who's the first thinker to really start to understand this about the nature of resources, that resources are in a very real way a creation of human beings?
Well, that's a very good point and a subtle point, and it's one that some of your own writings has emphasized and reminded a lot of people about, that so-called natural resources really aren't natural in the sense that they're just free and we just pluck them and use them, but they're more manufactured resources where we have to do a lot of work to turn them into something that we can use. I think a very key person in the history of mineral thought is Erich Zimmermann, who beginning in the 1930s wrote extensively, and he has a treatise called World Resources and Industries, which should be on all of our bookshelves who are interested in energy economics, mineral economics. And Zimmermann was an institutionalist from the institutionalist school of economics, which is a very useful way of looking at real-world economics. And Zimmermann understood the importance of energy, that energy was a master resource, even though he didn't use the term. And he was very good on the idea that resources really come from the mind, not so much the ground, that resources are not, resources become, that only in a human sense and in a business, technological, economic sense do resources have meaning. And Zimmermann saw unused resources, or what would later become resources, as just stuff in the earth, or mass in the earth. And it was human ingenuity that turned the stuff, the neutral stuff of the earth, into usable resources. And in this sense, Erich Zimmermann foreshadowed the later thinking of Julian Simon, who a lot more people are familiar with.
Yeah, that's such a brilliant point about how just this realizing that something is a resource to someone. It's a relational term. I mean, and it requires that it's, as he points out, it isn't just there. It's not just there as a resource. You have to do something, and that includes you need to understand it and recognize it as a resource to human beings for a certain purpose. And I like the designation of stuff, because we have to realize that throughout human history, most of what we call resources, the things that are both producing our energy and just physically constituting the world around us, were lying around just doing absolutely nothing. So is he really, would you call him the innovator on those, at least introducing those points? Because I don't know anyone who comes before, but I don't know the history nearly as well as you do.
Well, his 1933 book, which he revised in 1951, I believe, World Resources and Industry, is certainly a seminal book. And I think it's, I would say it's the first treatise since Jevons, A Coal Question. And Zimmermann, he really got it. And he called his theory the functional theory, which really means real world. And at the same time, Zimmermann was writing on resources, exactly 2 years before Zimmermann's treatise came out in 1933. A technical economist named Harold Hotelling wrote a piece that was and still is the most influential essay in the history of mineral economics, called The Economics of Exhaustible Resources, which was published in the Journal of Political Economy in 1931. And Hotelling had a very different view. His key assumption was fixity, where there was known fixed supply. In other words, it's a perfect knowledge scenario. And what Hotelling was really thinking about was oil. And if you read the beginning of this seminal article and the end, you see that Hotelling is very focused on oil, and he's applying it to the real world. And Hotelling basically comes to the conclusion, with perfect knowledge, with his fixity assumption, is that as more of the mineral is produced and consumed, that the cost of finding it must go up and the selling price must go up. And there's a price premium, in other words, involved with fixity, the mineral resource, that doesn't exist with other goods and services that are reproducible in human time frames. So out of Harold Hotelling comes the fixity depletion exhaustion view of a special cost and price premium, what Hotelling, or what became known in the literature as user cost. Now what's important about Hotelling is that this could apply to water in a canteen in the desert. In other words, it's not so much any mineral, it's just like any fixed supply. And Hotelling is what he basically did was to present a mathematical exercise, which is irrefutable, but by assuming fixity and assuming perfect knowledge, he really assumed away the real world. And that's why Eric Zimmerman dismissed Hotelling's analysis, his 1931 article, as just a jumble of numbers. So here we go with economists in the real world versus economists in their never land of perfect knowledge.
So I want to go back to looking at Hotelling, some of those assumptions in a minute, because that's, you could almost, what you said could almost just be reading off most of what we hear today about resources. It's certainly a prevailing view. But let's step aside for a second, or step back for a second, and look at evidence. How do these, if we start with Jevons and then go forward, what was the evidence that was borne out about the production of resources? How did coal production fare? How did oil production fare pre and post Hotelling?
Well, the story from the very beginning has been more and more supply. It's almost like the more we find and use, the more we discover to be mined and used. And what's going on here is that there's the ultimate resource, a term used by Julian Simon, and that's human ingenuity. And human ingenuity is not a depleting resource, it's an expanding resource. Every advance we have in human knowledge increases the possibilities for future breakthroughs in knowledge and technology. And the other thing that's going on, and this brings in the institutional side that was so important to Zimmerman, and which is very important to the free market view of the world, is that under capitalism, where you have expanding savings and investment or capital and expanding machinery, that we become more productive in finding so-called fixed or non-depletable resources. So what's important here is not so much minerals leading to peak oil or peak gas. What's really important here is incentives and private property rights, and the threat to expanding, cheapening minerals is really what I call peak government, and this leads to the point that sometimes in history, where we have a lot of government intervention, mineral resources go up in price, and it fools people into thinking that Harold Hotelling's user cost is suddenly operative. But the problem there is not free markets and human ingenuity, the natural state of things, but it's artificial government intervention. And the major exhibit of that is the 1970s in the United States, when we had oil shortages and natural gas shortages due to price and allocation regulation.
Yeah, well, that's so many points. I don't even know where to go next. But yeah, that sticking on the issue of Hotelling's point about assuming "quote unquote" perfect knowledge, it's always going to cost more to produce something. That would apply to anything, right? Because the way any resource would work, assuming you have the same amount of knowledge, is that the first thing you try to, like the first iron ore you mine is going to be the easiest. You're going to choose the cheapest and easiest, and then you're going to choose the next cheapest and next easiest, the next. And thus you would assume, well, we've been getting iron for a couple thousand years, so we must have, and even back then some people were talking about we're running out of iron, so now it must be super expensive to get iron. Yet, so why are all of our steel things so cheap? And of course, what's happening, as you said, is the technology is really and the human mind is the unrecognized resource here, because you mentioned the more resources we use, the more we have. And that's no accident, because in using them and producing them, we're getting all of this new knowledge. And that knowledge is ultimately what differentiates us from everyone else. And to talk about perfect knowledge is just philosophically such a corruption, and it really orients people in the wrong direction, because the direction we should be oriented in is we've got this massive ball of raw materials, most of which we probably don't know 1/100th the potential of how to use. And the whole task is to grow knowledge, but there's no sort of platonic world of perfect knowledge that we're somehow close to that says, yeah, you can only do this with oil, you can only do this with coal, you can only do this with gas, you can only mine them this way. And fortunately, but at the same time, it becomes a self-fulfilling fallacy, because the people who say resources are hopeless are the same ones who control people in exercising their ingenuity to create resources.
Right. There's a couple of very important points in what you just said. One is that Hotelling's analysis not only applies to minerals, which fall into his fixity paradigm, but it also can apply to non-minerals, reproducible goods and services, where there's a fixed supply because of locational specifics, water in the desert. So Hotelling's analysis, really doesn't apply to, he used the term exhaustible resources, but, if we define resources as being anything, it can apply to minerals or non-minerals. And then there was something else that your analysis triggered in my mind, and it'll come back to me in a second.
All right, no problem. The thing about the exhaustible, I think it's constantly blending the raw material with the resource, which, as Julian Simon likes to say, and I find this formulation very helpful, is the service that we get from the raw material. So this idea of renewable, what it's implying is that nature somehow is just replenishing an unlimited amount of some service. And that is true of basically zero things. I mean, it's true of oxygen. It's true of certain basic prerequisites, but it's certainly not true of clean water. It's not true of any form of energy. Of course, it gives us the sun, but in a modern sense, that's not much of a resource because that can't, right now, it doesn't give us cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. So when they talk about it's replenishing, well, it's replenishing a non-economic resource. So how valuable is that? And at the same time, the things that are so-called non-renewable, like oil, well, if Michael Lynch, who's been on the show and who writes for Master Resource, he pointed out once in a really brilliant comment on one of his blogs that oil, which is based on decayed plant animal matter, that replenishes at a certain rate. We just happen to use a lot more than that rate. But let's say we use 2 million barrels a year. Well, we'd kill our standard of living, but oil would be a renewable resource. So the whole conceptualization is an anti-economic conceptualization. The way to think about it is, at any given time, what is the best, cheapest way of doing something? Right. And with human ingenuity, you're always figuring out better ways, and it's progressive.
And this is because even some mainstream economists, one of them being Milton Friedman, they came to the conclusion that petroleum is not an exhaustible or depleting resource. And certainly business firms and entrepreneurs, they're constantly replenishing supply. And so in economic and business terms, it's a fallacy. It can lead to very bad results to think that minerals are somehow different from all the other goods and services. Entrepreneurs in oil, gas, and coal, some of them had thought, oh gosh, the price of my commodity is going to be going up in the future because of fixity and depletion, and therefore I'm going to make decisions based on that increasing price assumption, and they've gotten into trouble. And the same thing is true with policymakers, politicians, bureaucrats that form economic policy based on the increasing scarcity of minerals. That has turned into very bad policy too. So I think the conclusion is that we need to look at the mineral resource industries as manufacturing industries. And there's a quotation from the 1980s by Tom DeGregory, a economist at the University of Houston, who was a student of Eric Zimmerman, and I think it's worth recalling or quoting. And this comes from an article entitled "Resources Are Not, They Become an Institutional Theory," that was published in the Journal of Economic Issues. And DeGregory said, quote, "If resources are not fixed but created, then the nature of the scarcity problem changes dramatically. For the technological means involved in the use of resources determines their creation and therefore the extent of their scarcity. The nature of the scarcity is not outside the process that is natural, but a condition of it." And this gets very much to the point, Alex, that you independently discovered and wrote about, and that is that natural resources aren't really natural.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I discovered that. I mean, I thought a lot about it. Maybe I've said some interesting, original things about it.
Well, you know what? I think you independently discovered it. It wasn't like you were the first person, but from your philosophical perspective and your knowledge and your intuition of nature versus man, you came to this conclusion, and I thought it was very interesting that you independently came to that.
Yeah, I found it helpful in my own thinking to think of natural resources as not naturally a resource. But speaking of philosophy, it's worth bringing up Ayn Rand here, since I think we'll talk about Julian Simon in a minute, but I think Ayn Rand is really underrated and just about everything, but certainly on this point. If you read Atlas Shrugged, I mean, I know you have and talked about it, but if people read Atlas Shrugged with the resources question in mind, you'll see that there are many scenes and discussions in the book that directly address this issue, including just one with oil, where Ellis Wyatt the oil tycoon is talking about how he is going to figure out how to tap, interestingly enough, shale oil, which is, of course, a big issue now. But the whole driving thing behind it, and the whole driving thing behind the book, is the power of the human mind. And what Wyatt does is he takes this mountain that's completely unusable to anyone and makes it into a gusher of oil. And then when he withdraws the mind from it, he doesn't tell people he does it. He lights it on fire, but it just becomes a torch. But even if he hadn't lit it on fire, it would just become a useless mountain. And that points to the point that the world is just a ball of raw materials that follow certain scientific laws that are just waiting for human beings to figure out how to render valuable. And in the essay, What is Capitalism?, Ayn Rand, I don't have a direct quote, but it's something very close to, she talks about natural resources, and she says those natural resources are just so much raw materials without the aid of man. So I think she's a really important figure for those in resource economics or resource philosophy more broadly to read.
Yeah, Atlas Shrugged, published in 1957, is fascinating on a lot of different levels. And I read the book cover to cover some years ago, just focused on energy. How does she understand and treat energy in the book? And it's just fascinating because she captures the major themes of Eric Zimmerman and Julian Simon. The importance of energy, the master resource, being one of them, and also what you just talked about, how energy is not so much a natural resource but a man-made one, that both on the supply and the demand side, energy, its usefulness is all about man and doesn't exist independent of man. And the way that she uses light as a metaphor, energy as a metaphor, where, oh gosh, I wish I had the quotations in front of me, but we could have a separate segment on the energy of Atlas Shrugged, which is something that I've given talks on before, and I need to put together in a journal article.
Yeah, it's just to come with a couple of references, since as listeners might imagine this is a subject I like. I mean, if you look at the beginning of the book, what is the focus? The whole focus is motive power. You know, what powers the world? And then there are two senses in which that's used in the book. The ultimate sense is that the human mind is the motive power of the world, and that's ultimately in the book. Close your ears if I'm giving anything away. But you know, that's what John Galt is withdrawing from the world, and that's what causes the world to go downhill. But the other sense, in the more immediate sense, is the focus on energy, because energy is motive power, the power to move things around productively to benefit human life. And thus, it's no accident that there's a focus on, you know, the energy needed to make steel, you know, the energy needed to power a railroad, that a huge number of the disasters in the book occur because of the exit of Ellis Wyatt and oil production from the scene. That ultimately Galt's goal in the book, I mean, that the sign that the civilization, that the what he'd call it, like the looter state, or the rule by force, the sign that that's collapsed, is that the lights go out. And there's a real I didn't realize it before I got into energy so much, but there's just such a deep appreciation of the role of energy in human life, and then the role of the mind in energy. And those are the two fixtures of this show.
The political economy of energy that comes into play. Rand, in her novel, she sketches out the scenarios of price controls leading to physical shortages, where you have blackouts and you have motive power that's suddenly gone, and the trucks and cars and trains stop. Is very interesting, and I wish I could talk to Rand to see where she got her understanding of the dynamics of government intervention in energy. And my hypothesis is that having lived through World War II, where there was physical rationing of petroleum and other carbon-based energies, and having seen blackouts, brownouts, and shortages, that that is where she got her understanding of government intervention versus affordable, plentiful energy.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot. She certainly knew a lot of economics. I mean, she knew people like Ludwig von Mises personally. She's also just brilliant, and there's certain. I mean, you can only say if someone is just a really original thinker, there's only so much you can say. I think my suspicion is that a significant amount of it has to do with the kind of mind that she has as a novelist. Because if you look at her notes in preparing Atlas Shrugged, she talks about how I need to understand very concretely, an emphasis on concretely, how a society declines. And because she has the necessity in a novel of having a plot that's very tightly tied together, and where causes lead to effects, I think that gave her, or enhanced her very intricate causal understanding of how a society works. Whereas if you look at the backgrounds of most people who think about these things, they're often spending just time in academia, and it's easy to get a little detached from concrete reality. Whereas even if you're thinking about it for purposes of a novel, you have to study it. What exactly does this do to a businessman? And thus, and how exactly do these politicians work? How is it that why do they do these things? And those kinds of questions, and then having a brilliant mind thinking about the answers, plus the exposure to economic theory, I think leads to just this very nuanced thing. But if I haven't said it before, and I have, go read Atlas Shrugged, everyone.
Yes, and it's selling so well in the Obama era because a lot of it is coming true. And Rand's methodology was the objective real world, and if you start with that methodology, you are going to end up understanding reality much more than those that use false assumptions. And Harold Hotelling is an example of that.
Yeah, and it's a real challenge, and it's part of why I wanted to bring you on the show to question assumptions, because there is a certain internal logic to the Hotelling view and the modern view of this is finite, the way people think of finite. This is finite, therefore they think of it as, look, there's a certain amount of food on the table, and we're just gonna, every time we eat the food, it's disappearing and we're going to run out. And don't we wish we had just a pizza box full of pizza that every time we took a slice it replenished? And that's how people think of renewable energy. In terms of, instead of, I think the views that you've shared with us are that the earth is just, it's almost no resources at the beginning. It's just a bunch of raw materials. And the whole thing is we've got this incredible mass, which we've only touched a tiny portion of. How do we intelligently make use of that mass? So how do we put food on the table? Not how do we take food that's already given to us, but there's no limit to how much food we can put on the table if only we figure it out. But if we focus on let's not eat too fast, that's the wrong focus.
Right. Well, let's explore the idea of fixity a bit. There was a estimate that came out maybe about 10 years ago, estimating all the carbon-based energy that the world had consumed versus how much we believe is still there. Not only proved reserves, but probable resources and even speculative resources. And the answer came out to be that we had consumed from the mid 1800s to the present about 1.4% of what we think exists. Now, that sounds incredibly small, but when you look at energy growth, that's actually only 200-300 years of supply left. So you would think, the fixity assumption, really comes into play. However, if they redid that estimate today, given boom in oil and gas production from the shale supplies, then that 1.4% would shrink to well under 1%. I haven't done the math, but I'm guessing. So what's happening here is that, in some theoretical sense, there is fixity, and maybe it's it's certainly a lot less than the mass of the Earth for minerals, but that fixed supply is always growing because human ingenuity is discovering ways to get that resource that just weren't there before. For example, with oil, you think of crude oil and peak crude oil. Well, crude oil is just one part of the petroleum family. Now we have tar sands from, heavy oils from Canada and elsewhere. We have ore emulsion from Venezuela, and we can make oil synthetically from coal. So once you start looking at the whole hydrocarbon resource family, what is supposedly fixed becomes very, very big, and then thinking of oil more broadly, and it's very expensive, but we can get oil from agricultural crops. So at some point in the future, who knows how many hundreds of years or even millennia, we go from so-called depletable resources to renewable resources. So we're always underestimating what the, quote, fixed, close quote, supply is, but at some point it morphs into things that people will recognize are really not fixed. So this is a reason why Julian Simon said that he expected energy to become ever more plentiful and cheaper indefinitely.
So the oil example strikes me as a great example of the point you made earlier that resources are manufactured, because there's this view again of oil as something nature gives us, and A, it doesn't give us very much, just sort of on the ground lying around, and B, we didn't really know how to use it until starting in the mid 1800s, and then to really use it in the 20th century with things like modern petroleum products and all the different modern petroleum fuels. So it doesn't make sense to think of it. It's I think of a primitive view almost to think of any given material as just the earth gives us this much of it. It doesn't make sense to think of it that way because we can manufacture more and more. We have more and more control to manufacture more and more physical materials. So what nature does is sometimes it'll give us an indication of, wow, this type of substance is valuable, this kind of chain of hydrogen and carbon, and we can take that and make more.
Here's the extension. Now we can go from the earth, fix minerals in the earth, to minerals that we get from asteroids and other masses that are in space. And as a matter of fact, wasn't there an announcement just a matter of weeks ago of companies that are going to start exploiting resources from places beyond the Earth?
Yeah, I mean, and we had an article on, actually we published it on Master Resource about nuclear space propulsion and how that would be, that caliber of propulsion would be an essential ingredient to doing this economically. But of course there's the ocean. I mean, there's so much stuff. As much as amazing things have happened, there's been so many so-called green restrictions that are just stunting the potential. So the potential is just unlimited. And one more thought about resources that occurs to me is, again, the view of the modern view of resources is not an economic view, because for something to really be a resource, it's not just that you can use it somehow. It's that it's the one you want to use because it's the best. And that's something that's continually changing. So the issue with oil is not just, can we produce this amount of stuff? It's, can that service, is this the best way to perform that service? And I would hope that going forward, we would find better and better ways of performing that service, something even more compact to do it, or a cheaper way to manufacture it. But we don't just sort of get things and then consume them. We manufacture them at certain costs, and then we consume the best things that we can manufacture.
Right.
And all that process requires is freedom.
And what you're getting at is substitution. The different alternatives we have to perform the same service. So, there's many different types of energy, and we can expect that the substitution possibilities increase.
That is a really important economic concept to have. We are running to the end of the hour, but I want to make sure we get in Julian. Can you just say 2 or 3 minutes about two figures? First, and they're opposing figures. First is Marion King Hubbert, and the second is Julian Simon.
Okay, well, M. King Hubbert was a shell geologist who became very well known in the industry starting in the 1950s with some predictions of peak oil and peak gas in the United States and the world. And for many decades, people thought his predictions were right. Well, guess what? With the recent changes in technology and oil and gas production in the United States and abroad, he has now been refuted.
Well, so, I mean, his discrete, and as you said in the book, I believe, which was before the modern shale revolution, he made a bunch of predictions about oil and gas in the future, and the people who, the peak oil types only seized on the one prediction that was correct. But of course, anyone can it doesn't refute the proper view of resources for any given resource in any given place to be produced. To predict a declining quantity of production, there can be many reasons for that, including superior other resources, superior other places. But he did make many wrong predictions that we don't hear about, right? Right.
Well, what it ends up that he makes, he is right for the wrong reasons, and he's wrong for the right reasons. So, but he's the latest example of error from the fixity in the peak oil, peak gas school. He was sort of the industry version of Harold Hotelling, and now he's been refuted as well.
Yeah, although, theoretically he had already been refuted at the time, but even that discrete famous prediction that everyone loves to cite has very fortunately been reversed, as in U.S. oil production is increasing, particularly in North Dakota. Looks like a lot of other places coming soon, because I like calling it the given view of resource, because resources are not just given to us. We manufacture them through human ingenuity, and a lot of brilliant people figured out how to manufacture from formerly unusable shale. And that brings us to the most famous pro-free market resource theorist, Julian Simon.
Right, and Julian Simon began as a Malthusian. He had a very pessimistic view of the world, and he was two things. One was he was an empiricist. He looked at the data, and number two, he had an open mind. And early on in his career, he looked at the statistics, and he came to the startling conclusion that turned Malthusianism on its head, that increasing human population was positively correlated with increasing minerals, better environment, more economic progress, and really all good things. So Simon comes to the conclusion that human beings are not the problem, human beings are the solution. And one of his quotations, simple quotation, is that human beings create more than they destroy. And I remember I had a discussion with someone who was very concerned that the price of minerals was going to go up because we had all this increased supply from growing population in China. And I remember making the point as well, those same people that are going to be consuming more resources, they're not only consumers, but they're producers, and their human minds are going to increase resources, minerals, etc., probably faster than they will consume them, and that seems to be the case.
Yeah, I would say the absolute least that's the case. I mean, there's a lot that the rise of China has done for us economically, and that actually certain problems that it's concealed economically. I like to think of it as being on an island. If I'm on an island and I want to live, do I just want myself there, or do I want 5 smart people? And then if I want 5 smart people, would I rather have 50 smart people? Yeah, absolutely. Now, maybe you wouldn't stick them all on at the exact same time, or if you did, it would take a little adjustment. But because the mind is the root of resources, the more minds, the better. And with that, we need to wrap up. Rob, can you hang on the line for about another minute? I have a question for you after we end the show. But let's wrap it up for now. We're at about 59 minutes. I don't want to go over the hour. I hope everyone is excited about the new weekly format. I hope you're excited about videos. I want to thank everyone who gave to the fundraiser to make Power Hour Weekly possible. I think you're going to learn a lot. I'm going to learn a lot. It's going to help everything we do at Center for Industrial Progress. It's going to introduce you to 4 times as many people. We'll be able to cover a lot more subjects. And again, because we're going to start doing video, you'll be able to see this on YouTube. We'll post excerpts on YouTube, so those who don't want to listen to an hour can find 5 minutes that they really like and share. So I'm very excited and optimistic about the future. If you want to continue to support the show or the Center for Industrial Progress, you can go to www.industrialprogress.net/donate. And if you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, you can email me at alex@industrialprogress.net. So until next week, not next month. So make sure to subscribe on iTunes. Go to industrialprogress.net for more details. Go to masterresource.org to read more from Rob Bradley. And until next week, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been Power Hour.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.